Hey there, this is Dan. You're watching The Salty Sea, and I could not be any happier. We did it. We got a winter FAQ, and it's an amazing balance update for the game. Hopefully, won't be too much of a change for the more casual players who don't play a ton, but a lot of the stuff you would see at events has been fixed and tinkered with to remove a lot of the exploits, and I think we should all be really excited. Let's get straight into it. The losers are monster lovers. 100-point increase for nearly every single monster in the game. Just take a second, let that sink in. I'll sip some tea. Yeah, 100 points. Now, chimeras are still going to be pretty good, I think. I was looking at some lists with chimeras, and you lose a lot, but they were sitting around a 75% win rate before, and so there's a lot of space for nerfs before you go from 75 down to 50. Now, the other non-chimera monsters have been completely kneecapped. I'll be curious to see what people's attempts to make lists out of those non-chimera monsters end up looking like. I think a lot of people are going to be happy about this. Monsters were not creating the most feel-good stories in the game, so it's nice to see those kind of just really taken out behind the woodshed. Now, there are some other losers here, say spooky things. Resurrections got some major changes. You can see here in the rules around raised fighters. They don't get to activate that round, which is really, really, really big on your action economy. Before, you could resurrect, say, a graveguard right next to a fight that was already happening, and then that graveguard would just kill whatever was in the fight. Now you won't be able to do that. If you raise a fighter, you're still getting ahead in the, say, attrition matchup that's happening in a round in a game, but you're not getting ahead on activations that round. So your opponent has time to play around the ability. That's going to be a really big deal, I think. And I'm kind of gutted for Nighthaunt, who were not really abusing this and needed to be able to do it. And their fighters were so killable when they were resurrected, because they resurrect with very few health and always toughness 4, that it hurts to see them get hit this hard with something that was meant to really take out Soulblight Gravelords. Soulblight also has the issue now of when you resurrect an elite unit, you don't resurrect them at full health anymore. You resurrect them with the dice value of wounds left. That combined with the rules about, what a raised fighter can and can't do is really going to shift the balance of power in Soulblight Gravelords more towards skeletons, which skeleton spam was already very, very good. So it is going to kneecap a lot of the strongest Soulblight Gravelords lists, but Soulblight is still going to be a real menace at the table. Support heroes are another big loser here. Swift as the Wind and Lead from the Back were both nerfed. Swift as the Wind now adds half the value to movement. Doesn't matter for me, I was only ever rolling 1s or 2s with Swift as the Wind anyway. But for most people with normal luck, this is a pretty big change. You won't be able to roll 3 6s and then be able to pop Swift as the Wind, wait, move all your people, fly them across the board, then move 9 inches over to another deployment zone, and then have those people all fly across the board. That's not really going to be possible anymore, but Swift as the Wind is still going to be a decent little utility move spell. People use Wa, people use the Flesh Eater Court's move spell, even though those have been nerfed, so you'll still see some people running Swift as the Wind, running Tempest Eye allies, but it won't be nearly as overpowering as it was before. The combo of slingshotting an Annihilator Prime across the board with ease is going to be a lot less dangerous now. It might still be attractive, but it won't be nearly as overpowering. The same is true with Lead from the Back. Adding 1 to the attack's characteristic instead of sometimes adding 2, sometimes adding 3 is a pretty big change. I mean, -2 attacks on some of the models that were getting boosted from it is a pretty massive amount of less damage. Again, Skaven heroes, you might still see them because AoE damage buffs are fun to play with and are fun to build around, but it's not going to be nearly as overpowering. It's just going to really change which support heroes you use. The other thing is Gloomspite Gits, their reaction was changed to only affect other Gloomspite Gits, which Gits Soup was a really powerful list around the community, and bringing in allies for Gits becomes a lot less attractive now. Now, if you're looking to make Destruction Soup, Gits are still a really attractive destination for that because they have all those nets. But the combo-rific parts of it are going to be significantly lessened. Luckily, there's a whole world of second-tier support abilities that are out there that people can combo with. So Soup is not dead by any means, but I think the top Soup concepts that people were gravitating to over and over and over again, those have all been hit a little bit in this FAQ. So some really minor losers are some of the fighters that on their sort of at face value, they weren't using any of these abilities, but they were really benefiting from comboing with things that did. So anything slow in order, we're talking about Stone Guard, we're talking about Arcanauts, we're talking about Annihilators, we're talking about Fire Slayers, we're talking about Dispossessed as well, Dwarves in general, really. All of them are hurt a little bit by this, but most of them are still going to be okay. You can still get by with the small buff in Cities of Sigmar. Plenty of Cities of Sigmar heroes are playable on their own, even with a weak buff. The question here is, are you going to be able to play bad support heroes whose buffs have been nerfed a little bit? You probably won't. But really good ones that also just carry the buff, you can probably still play those. And a lot of these Move 3 fighters still have some utility on their own, even with this big nerf to them. The same is going to be true of all of the low attack numbers, but really high strength and really high damage output fighters that are in Chaos. So things like Bloodkinds or all of the bull gores with the really big weapons. Same is true of Slaughter Priests, Ogre Breachers, lots of Khorne, Iron Golem stuff, and Beasts of Chaos stuff. Really, really combos with lead from the back. And all of that has been hit just a little bit. There's plenty of other really solid ways to play Khorne. There's other really solid ways to play Iron Golems. Beasts of Chaos were doing fine even without a Skaven hero in a lot of builds. So these factions are going to be okay, but they've all lost one of their combos that they had access to. So just one build path you could take these factions on has been taken away. And so that makes them very minor losers here. But let's get on to the winners, because that's the incredibly exciting part. The biggest winners here are professional painters. Now let's talk a little bit about why that's true. Underworlds are back. And if you're a huge hobbyist, you should be a huge fan of this, because those Underworld sculpts let you flex your painting skills better than anything else that's out there. But if we want to talk list building, most Underworld's warbands are on the old algorithm. And so fast stuff is a lot better in Underworlds than it is in the current paradigm of 2.0 Warcry. So things like Spikeclaw's Swarm, things like Slake Slash out of Dread Pageant, all of those are going to be much better. All of the elves are often going to be some of the best things in their faction now. For example, Lumineth Realm Lords. You could take a Blade Lord, or you could take the 105 point Blade Lord in Mayari's Purifiers that does roughly similar amounts of damage, but has 2 more wounds for 5 fewer points. Obviously, you're going to take the Underworld's Blade Lord there. All of those are very, very good now, but some of the chunky boys from Underworlds are essentially unplayable. For example, everything in Ironjaws is way better than Morgoth's Crushers. The same is going to be true about the older Underworld stuff from Stormcast, so things like Stormsire's Curse Breakers, and the other two, sort of the Liberator one as well. Those are all going to be a lot worse. Now, some Underworld stuff is on the new algorithm, all the Harrow Deep stuff, for example. So Calthea Zandire and the Cruel Boys one. Huge tools for Cruel Boys. I could have easily just put Cruel Boys as a faction on the winners column because they just gained 2 nets without having to ally in any gits. That's pretty huge for them. So a lot to love. A lot of tools for list builders, people who love kind of tinkering around with stuff. You lost a lot of exploits in the things that got kneecapped as far as exploiting monsters, exploiting certain support hero buffs that, you know, were way too good and needed to be brought in line with the rest of the game. Now you can kind of dig through the Underworlds warbands to search for new things to kind of get extra value here and there. Another big winner is Arsonists. Anyone who likes setting fires. Flamethrowers got a big buff. You can now, if you have a ranged weapon with no minimum distance, for example, flamethrowers and javelins are essentially the 2 things this applies to. You can now shoot into combat if you are within 3 inches of the thing you're fighting. So if you are charged by, you know, a big scary dragon and you and one of your melee fighters are in combat with it, you no longer have to just run away with your ranged unit completely unable to do anything. You can just blast it twice. If someone charges into you, you can now use your minimum range thing without having to disengage first and then shoot. So lots of things to like there about Arsonists. Things like Salamanders, things like the Horns of Hashut Flamethrower, things like Huanchi's Claw, all got just a little bit better in terms of just quality of life improvements. Now, one of the big winners here, and I'm interested to see how this actually plays out, is mid-range fighters. Things like Painbringers, things like Blood Warriors, things like the Jade Obelisk. Anything over 80 points, but under 120 points, that was really good at outfighting chaff, but really terrible at, say, going toe-to-toe with a Stormcast, getting hit by monsters, randomly dying to surprise resurrected Graveguard. Basically, 2 of your 3 big predators in the meta have gone away, or at least taken a hit. I don't think Graveguard have gone away by any means, but they have taken a hit and they won't hurt nearly as much. Those sorts of fighters are going to be a lot happier now. And there's a big test coming because I think a lot of the changes are going to push people more towards swarm lists. There's 2 things happening in the meta right now. One is a lot of tournament organizers are experimenting with the Gur Rumble pack that was released late in the fall last year. That Rumble pack vastly favors swarm warbands, anything with at least 9 models, preferably 10 or 11 or 12. And in theory, mid-range fighters should be able to fight swarms pretty well, and we're going to find out if that's actually true. The other thing that's pushing us towards swarms, by the way, is just that with making it so that Graveguard and elite things don't resurrect quite as well, a lot of Soulblight Gravelords lists that you were seeing out there were actually pushing a whole bunch of different heroes, and so they actually were skimping on chaff quite a bit because they knew they could just resurrect the same chaff model over and over, so they could just throw the chaff model into your face and just keep resurrecting it. And so the pressure to actually run a ton of Graveguard wasn't really there. You could just run 5 or 6 Graveguard and it could feel like you had a million of them. And so you were seeing things like a Dreadblade Harrow and a Flesh Eater Quartz ally and a big hero. And so those lists are probably going to shift towards running more of their hyper-efficient chaff since they can't just endlessly recycle them in your face. Things like, say, Lead from the Back, things like Swift as the Wind, we're encouraging people to ally in, heroes, which again are not chaff, into their warbands to hypercharge a lot of more mid-range fighters because you're better off using abilities to sort of get extra value from things that already had high impact anyway. Now, both of those have gone away. Both of those were sort of leading people towards more elite warbands. So now swarms are going to be a big part of the meta for both these FAQ changes and for the Rumble Pack reasons. And we're going to find out if mid-range fighters were actually tuned enough. A lot of people were noticing that mid-range fighters were a lot more points efficient in 2nd edition than they were previously. And a lot of people got really excited about that. They were essentially pushed out of the meta right away. This is their time. If they don't shine here, they're never going to shine. And GW are going to have to do something drastic to save all these 80 to 120 point fighters. The other winner here is Assassins. I've got 2 snipers. The Bolt Boy boss got an armor shredding buff. Before, it was unclear if, say, when it says it crits on 4-ups, the Bolt Boy boss has an ability that says you crit on 4-ups. It was unclear if that meant when you were shooting against something with toughness 5, if you were critting on 4s, or if you hit on 5s and then crit on 5s and miss on 4s. They made it clear that it actually improves your hit percentage as well. Essentially, you crit on 4s even if you would normally only hit on 5s. They also did a few other changes to make it more clear that a hit and a critical hit are 2 completely separate things, and anything that just says critical hit or just says hit does not mean the other one. So that's a pretty big buff for the Bolt Boy boss if you weren't already playing it that way. Also, Pyrocasters got their fly rune mark to help them match with other flamers. So that's 2 pretty big little buffs for 2 snipers in the game there that are definitely going to be more playable now. These were already kind of on the fringes of the competitive scene, and I wouldn't be surprised to see them kind of edge a little bit closer in. Pyrocasters do... A lot of people were taking them so that they could bracket monsters easily, and monsters have been hurt. So you might not see Pyrocasters jump up quite as much, but they are better than they used to be. The other winner here is Finesse Dragons. So I'm talking about Mizzen Masters. I'm talking about Aviarchs on Disc, Arch Revenants, Squig Hopper bosses. Anything that could fly across the battlefield, kill something, but then you can't survive a Chimera Dragon Maul with it. You can't charge into 2 Graveguards because you charge in, you kill one, the other one deals some damage to you, they resurrect the one you killed, now it finishes you off, and you've gained nothing. Now you actually kill one, even if they resurrect it, it doesn't get to attack you, the other one puts some damage onto you, and now you can bring another fighter in, probably kill the Graveguard because it doesn't have a lot of health, and now you've actually gained value here from your dragon charging in. Things that couldn't land near a Doombull, Mega Boss, Ogre, those are still a problem. But again, this is a thing where 2 of the 3 things that were pushing these types of fighters out of the meta are gone. And people were running Mizzen Masters anyway, but there were a lot of things that could prey on them. Now there's a lot less that can prey on them, and so they're in a much better space. This is also a huge buff for Squig Riders because they changed Madcap Destruction. It's now a bonus move, whereas before it was just a move action. So it was essentially just a worse charge ability. Now, the fact that this is a bonus move action that then deals damage, you can do things like fly in with your Squig Hopper boss, finish something off that's been damaged already, and then attack something else. These are very, very powerful at this point. Being able to get a bonus move of that 8-inch, 10-inch movement, depending on which kind of Squig Rider you're using, is incredibly powerful. And if you were a Gits player and you were sad that your reaction change made it harder to ally in really powerful things into your Gits lists, you should be incredibly excited about Madcap Destruction, because all of the power you just lost from allies, you are gaining it back in that Squig Riders are incredibly powerful now. So that's going to be really cool for all the Gits players and should change up some list building for them in particular, make it much more attractive to go with multiple Squig Riders, whereas before you really never saw more than one. Another big winner is me. Well, not me. I'm actually a huge loser in this because I had painted a Chimera, but people who go to events. Let's take a moment to think about how the strongest things you could do in 2nd edition were 1, run a Chimera, 2, tune up a Soulblight Chaff list Again, we're talking about these lists that had multiple overlapping heroes that could resurrect each other and resurrect Graveguard into your face. Soup combo lists, most of those were running either Swift as the Wind or Lead from the Back, or it was like Destruction Soup putting lots of heavy hitters into Gloomspite Gits and having infinite combos there. And then also just finding a really interesting way to synergize with a non-Chimera monster that helped justify having something other than a Chimera. Most of those were just strictly worse than number one here, but they were still very, very good. All of those were nerfed to varying degrees. I think Soulblight Chaff and Soup combos nerfed a little bit less because there are other combos out there. But the Chimera being 100 points more, that's 2 fewer Plague Bearers. That's quite a few less things you can get in your list. Everyone who was running something other than the 4 best things in the meta, you picked up a lot of value there in your last 2 rounds. It wasn't really mattering for the first 2 rounds if you were playing competitively but not running one of these 2 things, but late in a tournament when you're only running against people who are doing these busted things, you're just either not going to see them as much or they're not going to be quite as overpowering, and you're going to have a lot more room to counterplay them. Note that random bad things from before aren't just going to be suddenly good now. When I say that mid-range fighters are a winner, for example, that doesn't mean that you can take Horns of Hashut and have all of the guys with that weird helmets. No, Horns of Hashut is a swarm warband with Shatterers. You're not going to be able to just run really bad mid-range fighters. You're not going to just, anything random out there isn't going to be a big winner. I did also fail to mention Iron Jaws, which got Duff Up the Big Thing for brutes. That should have been mentioned back here with in the mid-range fighters. A lot of Iron Jaws stuff is really good. But anyway, events just got a lot more interesting as far as the texture of what's going to be good and playable in them. And that should be really exciting for anyone who plays a lot of Warcry. So I'm really happy. My voice is shot for some reason these days. It's winter. My voice always dies in the winter. Until my next video, may all your rules be crits.